The letter crinkled in Ella Carter's fist like a dying thing. She stood in the center of Jeremiah Donnelly's kitchen, her travel dress still dusty from 3 days on the stage, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, and her brown eyes blazing with a fury that she had not bothered to disguise since the moment she read the words that had brought her to this sun-scorched corner of Texas in the first place. "Meek," she said, and the word came out like a bullet from a clean barrel. "You wrote to the agency and specifically requested a meek woman." Jeremiah stood on the far side of the oak table, arms crossed over his broad chest, jaw set in that particular way a man's jaw sets when he knows he is caught and refuses to admit it. He was taller than she had expected, with sun-darkened skin and green eyes the color of sage after rain, and under other circumstances she might have found him handsome. Under these circumstances, she found him insufferable. "I wrote what I wrote," he said carefully. "Accommodating," she continued, unfolding the letter with trembling precision and reading aloud. "Must be accommodating, must not interfere with ranch operations, must not have opinions about the management of property, livestock, or personnel." She looked up. Did I miss anything? Oh, yes, she found the line. Must understand that a rancher's time is not her time and must not make demands upon it. The silence in that kitchen was the kind that had weight. Outside, a horse stamped. The wind pushed dust against the window glass. Somewhere further off, one of Jeremiah's hands was hammering something, the sound carrying flat and clean through the dry October air of 1878. "The agency said you were suitable," Jeremiah said. "The agency," Ella replied, setting the letter on the table between them with extraordinary control, "told you whatever you paid them to tell you. And I am going to be honest with you, Mr. Donnelly, because I find honesty considerably more useful than pretense. I'm not meek. I'm not particularly accommodating when accommodation means erasure. And if you were hoping to bring a woman from Philadelphia to this ranch to perform the function of a very quiet piece of furniture, then I am afraid you have wasted both our time and the stage fare." Something shifted in his face. She could not name it yet, but it shifted. "You read that letter before you came?" he asked. "I read it the moment Mrs. Aldrich handed me the correspondence file at the agency," Ella said, 2 days before my departure. "And you came anyway." "I came," she said, "because I have my own reasons for leaving Philadelphia, and because I thought that perhaps a man who ranches alone in the middle of nowhere might be more open to revision than his letter suggested. I appear," she added, letting her gaze travel the kitchen, noting the unwashed dishes, the unmended curtain, the pile of financial ledgers stacked so precariously they were a single breath from collapse, "to have judged that correctly, even if I judged nothing else correctly." The hammer outside went quiet. Jeremiah Donnelly stared at this woman who had arrived on his doorstep not weeping, not grateful, not soft-spoken, not any of the 12 things he had written down on that list and sent to the agency in a moment of grief-stricken practicality 9 months ago, and he felt something strange happen in his chest. Something that was not irritation, though it wore irritation's clothing. Something that he would not name until much later, when the stars over his land were so thick and bright they looked like spilled salt on black velvet, and Ella Carter had already turned his entire world irreversibly upside down. "You can have the guest room," he said at last. "I assumed," she replied, and picked up her travel bag from where she had set it by the door. That was how it began. 3 weeks earlier, Ella Carter had been standing in the narrow office of Aldrich Matrimonial Services on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, reading a rancher's requirements list with one eyebrow raised so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. Mrs. Aldrich, a compact woman with steel-gray hair and the manner of someone who had long since run out of patience for the complexities of human emotion, had slid the file across her desk with the air of presenting a reasonable option. "He has 1,400 acres in Bexar County, Texas," Mrs. Aldrich had said. "The ranch is profitable. He requires a wife for domestic stability. He lost his mother 2 years ago who had been managing the household, and he has not, in his own words, been managing well since. Ella had read the list again. "He has written 8 requirements, Mrs. Aldrich. Not one of them is about companionship. Many men of that type struggle to articulate. He has articulated quite clearly," Ella said. "He wants a housekeeper he doesn't have to pay." She paused. "And the agency accepted this listing." Mrs. Aldrich had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "He is a man of substance and has paid the full agency fee. The match criteria—" "Do not match me," Ella said flatly. "I know that and you know that. Miss Carter," Mrs. Aldrich folded her hands, "you are 26. You have been passed over 3 times by the families your own family selected. You have a history of," she glanced at her notes, "speaking out of turn, managing business affairs that were not yours to manage, and in one notable instance, corresponding directly with a bank without your father's knowledge to prevent a fraudulent loan." "The loan was fraudulent," Ella said. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point," Mrs. Aldrich said quietly, "is that Philadelphia society will not take you, Miss Carter. Your options are narrowing. This man is not asking for something perfect. He is asking for someone capable, and whatever else you are exceedingly capable." Ella had looked at the letter for a long time. She had thought about her father's house, where she moved through the rooms like a ghost, too loud and too sharp and too present for a family that had long since stopped knowing what to do with her. She had thought about her friend Clara's wedding last spring, and how Clara had looked across the church with that particular blank politeness that had replaced her real expression since the ceremony. She had thought about what it would mean to go west, to land that was raw and enormous, and had not yet decided what it expected of her. She had taken the file. She had not, however, submitted meekly. She had written back to Jeremiah Donnelly under the agency's letterhead, a brief and carefully professional letter in which she described herself with complete accuracy: educated, experienced in household management and basic accounting, physically capable and possessed of what she termed an independent perspective. She had listed her genuine qualities. She had not listed any that she did not have. He had not written back with objections. She had chosen to interpret this as acceptance. She was not entirely sure, standing in his kitchen in the October dust, that she had interpreted correctly. But she was here, and so was he, and the ledgers on that table were a disaster. The Donnelly Ranch, which bore no name besides Donnelly's, sat on rolling hill country south of San Antonio, where the limestone broke through the surface of the earth in great pale slabs, and the live oaks grew in clusters along the creek bottoms like conspirators. It was cattle country, and the cattle were everywhere. The sound of them carried on the wind along with the smell of sage and cedar, and the dry iron smell of Texas dirt in October. Jeremiah had built the main house himself, or largely himself, with help from his 2 permanent hands, a man named Hector who had been with the ranch for 11 years and a younger man named Tom who had come down from Kansas 2 years back and never quite gotten around to leaving. The house was solid and well constructed, the kind of building made by a man who understood that things built for permanence needed to be built with care. But it had not been decorated or properly maintained since his mother Margaret Donnelly had died of a fever in the spring of 1876, and its condition reflected that absence in every way. Ella spent her first evening not unpacking, not resting, but walking through every room with a lamp and a sharp eye, cataloging what she found. The kitchen was functional but chaotic. The parlor had accumulated a layer of undisturbed dust that spoke to genuine neglect. The study was impenetrable, buried under papers and correspondence that she could see at a glance had not been organized in years. The root cellar was adequate. The well was good. The smokehouse had been recently used. The barn was immaculate. She stood in the barn doorway at dusk and looked at the immaculate barn, and then she looked back at the house, and then she understood something important about Jeremiah Donnelly. He cared for what he loved. He had simply stopped loving the house when his mother left it. She went inside and cooked supper from what was available, which was not much, and set it on the table and called for Jeremiah with the same voice she used for everything, clear and direct and unapologetic. He came in from outside, washed his hands at the basin without being asked, and sat down across from her. They ate in silence for a while. "The accounts," she said finally. "The ledgers in the kitchen. I can see from here that the columns aren't balancing." He looked up. "Those aren't your concern. They will become my concern if the ranch loses money," she said pleasantly. "I am capable with figures. I managed my father's household accounts for 6 years and identified 3 instances of supplier fraud in that time. I am not suggesting I take them over. I am suggesting you let me look." He held her gaze for a long moment. She held his right back. "After supper," he said. It was, she would later reflect, a significant concession for a man who had written 8 requirements and not one of them was about companionship. The ledgers were, as she had suspected, a catastrophe. Not through dishonesty but through neglect, the kind that accumulated when a man was running a cattle operation single-handed and had no time or inclination to sit with numbers. There were 3 years of improperly recorded expenses, 2 cattle sales where the recorded income did not match the corresponding bank deposits, and a pattern of feed purchases that suggested whoever had been supplying them was charging inconsistently. "Your feed supplier," Ella said, pointing to a column. "Look at these prices. October of last year you paid 14 cents a pound. January you paid 17. But the prices in town," she had checked the posted rates at the general store that she'd seen from the stage window as it passed through, "didn't shift in that period. Someone has been charging you above market." Jeremiah leaned over the table beside her, and she was aware of his proximity in a way that she noted and set aside, because she was not the kind of woman who let awareness distract her from arithmetic. "That's Hayes," he said. "Bill Hayes. He's been supplying the ranch for 5 years. "Then he has been overcharging you for at least 18 months, Ella said. "I would need to see more records to tell you when it started." Jeremiah straightened and looked at her with an expression she could not quite classify. "How do you know how to do this?" "My father is a merchant," she said. "I grew up watching him manage accounts. When he stopped managing them well, I managed them for him. He didn't like it much, but the accounts improved." She paused. He liked that part somewhat more. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across Jeremiah's face and then thought better of itself and retreated. "I'll pull the other year's records tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said, and that was the end of their first evening. But not before she had gone upstairs to the guest room, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, looked at the patched quilt and the single candle and the window that looked out over the dark Texas hills, and allowed herself, very quietly, to feel something that was not quite hope but was in its neighborhood. She had secrets of her own, of course. Everyone did, in her experience, but hers had particular weight. The real reason she had left Philadelphia was not simply her family's diminishing patience with her character. It was the letter she had received from her father's business partner, a man named Gerald Marsh, 6 weeks before she left. The letter had been carefully worded and technically polite and had been, at its core, a threat. She had discovered that Marsh had been directing certain of her father's funds into investments that were not listed in any ledger her father had access to, and she had made the mistake of confronting Marsh about it privately before she had decided what to do with the information. The letter had made it clear that if she chose to cause trouble, trouble would find its way back to her. That she was, as he put it, a young unmarried woman whose reputation was already peculiar enough that an accusation of instability or dishonesty from a man of Marsh's standing would damage her permanently. That she ought to consider the wisdom of distance. She had considered it. She had also, before leaving, copied every document she could find into a second ledger that she had locked in her travel trunk. She had given a sealed letter to her friend Clara with instructions to open it only if Ella wrote requesting it. She had covered her own position as well as she knew how to cover it. And then she had come to Texas, because Texas was not Philadelphia, and because she was tired of being in rooms where the walls knew her secrets and belonged to people who did not wish her well. She had not told any of this to the agency. She had not told any of this to Jeremiah Donnelly. She told herself she would, when the time was right, when she had found her footing, when she understood what kind of man he was well enough to know whether the truth was safe in his hands. October settled into the hill country like a comfortable old coat, the temperatures dropping at night to something almost gentle after the furnace of the summer she had missed. Ella learned the ranch in the way she learned everything, systematically and without ceremony. She learned the names of the cattle, or at least the ones that had names, which were Hector's personal project and entirely without Jeremiah's endorsement. She learned that Tom was 23 and homesick and would talk for an hour about Kansas if given the opportunity. She learned that Jeremiah rose at 5 in the morning without exception and was in the barn before 6, and that the only time he was ever truly still was in the evenings, after supper, when he sometimes sat on the porch in the dark and looked at the hills. She learned that he watched her. Not in a manner that made her uncomfortable, but in the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, carefully and without pretense. She watched him too. She watched how he treated Hector, with respect that was genuine and not performed, the kind of respect that existed between men who had been through difficult times together. She watched how he handled the cattle with patience and competence, no wasted motion. She watched how he made decisions, quickly and without second-guessing himself, which she found she admired even when the decisions were wrong, because at least the man committed. On the 5th day, he found her reorganizing the study. She had not asked permission. She had simply begun, carrying one pile at a time to the kitchen table, sorting correspondence from accounts from legal documents from the miscellaneous category she privately labeled, things Jeremiah couldn't bring himself to throw away, which included a folded child's drawing of a horse, a woman's handkerchief with the initials M.D., and a letter in a handwriting that was clearly not Jeremiah's, dated 1869, which she did not read and set aside with what she hoped was adequate delicacy. He stood in the study doorway looking at what she had done. "This was organized," he said. "It was organized the way a creek bed organizes silt," she said, without looking up from the paper she was reading, which was a land deed she needed to file properly. "By the most recent flood." There was a silence. "That handkerchief was my mother's," he said. She looked up then. He was looking at the small pile she had set apart with care, not accusation in his face, but something raw underneath the surface of it. "I know," she said simply. "It's in the pile of things I didn't touch." He looked at the pile, he looked at her. Something passed across his face that she had not seen before, something unguarded. "Thank you," he said. He did not stay. He turned and went back out to the barn. But for the rest of that day, something between them was very slightly different, as if a door that had been shut had been opened just enough to let the light through. The issue with Bill Hayes came to a head 2 weeks into November, which was faster than Ella had anticipated, and it came to a head because she had made the mistake of being in the general store in Cibolo Creek, the small town 4 miles from the ranch, when Hayes himself came in to collect payment for an upcoming delivery. She had gone to town with Tom, who was picking up wire for a fence repair, and she had stopped in the store to buy lamp oil and a spool of thread, and she had been examining the posted rates on the chalkboard behind the counter when Hayes walked in. She knew who he was because she had studied all the names in the ledgers, and because in small towns the players are few and their faces match their names quickly. He was a stocky man in his 40s with a florid face and the confident manner of someone who was accustomed to not being questioned. He glanced at her with the mild curiosity men in small Texas towns directed at unfamiliar women. "You must be Donnelly's new wife," he said. Not unkindly, but with a faint condescension that she recognized immediately as the tone men used when they assumed the woman in front of them was primarily decorative. "I am Ella Carter," she said. "I am managing the household accounts at the Donnelly Ranch." She turned from the chalkboard. "And I noticed that the posted rate for feed corn is considerably lower than what has been invoiced to the ranch for the past 2 years. The friendly expression on Hayes's face did not disappear. It simply became a different kind of friendly, the kind with something watchful behind it. "Prices fluctuate," he said. "They do," she agreed pleasantly. "Upward and downward." The invoices to the Donnelly ranch appear to have fluctuated only in one direction. She paused. "I'll be recommending that we review the last 3 years of delivery records before any new arrangements are made." Hayes looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him without blinking, and then he turned to the storekeeper and conducted his business as if nothing had happened. But she saw the way his eyes found her once more as he left, and there was nothing friendly in them at all. She told Jeremiah that evening. She told him plainly and without drama, because she had decided that whatever else she would not be the kind of woman who managed crises by softening information until it lost its point. He listened. His jaw did the thing it did when he was containing a strong reaction. "How much?" he asked when she had finished. "I'll have a precise figure by the end of the week," she said. "Roughly speaking, I estimate $300 over 2 years, possibly more." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have caught that. You were busy keeping 1,400 acres running on your own," she said. "It's easy to miss when you're not looking in the right places." He looked at her then directly and seriously. "Why are you helping me?" The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected, but because of the way he asked it. Not with suspicion, not with the implication that she had hidden motives, with genuine curiosity, with something almost like bewilderment, as if kindness offered without obvious transaction still puzzled him. "Because the accounts needed to be helped," she said honestly. "And because if this ranch fails, I have nowhere to go." It was the most honest thing she had said to him, and it was not entirely the truth, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a small stone. He nodded slowly. "We'll confront Hayes together," he said. "I won't have you dealing with him alone." "I already dealt with him alone," she said. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful, but next time not alone." There was something in the way he said it, not commanding, not the tone of a man asserting authority, the tone of a man who was worried. She recognized the difference, and it moved something in her that she had been keeping very still. November brought rain, which the hill country received with the grateful extravagance of land that spent most of the year wanting it. The creek rose and the live oaks darkened and the cattle moved to higher ground, and Ella discovered that she liked rain in Texas in a way she had never liked rain in Philadelphia, where it was gray and apologetic and smelled of coal smoke. Here it was muscular and honest and smelled of cedar and wet limestone, and it fell straight down without any diffidence at all. She was on the porch watching it one afternoon when Jeremiah came and stood beside her, having come in from checking the creek level. He was wet to the shoulder and seemed unbothered by it. They stood in silence for a while, which was a kind of silence they had developed over the weeks, a silence that was not uncomfortable but inhabited the way a house is inhabited. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said. It was the first personal question he had asked her. She considered how much to tell him. "It's dense," she said. "Buildings everywhere, people everywhere, noise everywhere. I spent most of my life feeling crowded even when I was alone." "Do you miss it?" "I miss my friend Clara," she said. "I miss the library on Walnut Street. I do not miss being managed." He was quiet a moment. "Is that what they did, managed you?" "They tried," she said. "My mother wanted me to be interested in music and needlework and the social calendar. My father wanted me to be interested in marrying someone useful to his business. My sisters managed to want exactly what was wanted of them, which made everything considerably smoother for everyone except me." "And the agency," he said carefully, not looking at her. "You knew what I wrote." "I knew." "Why did you come?" She had been expecting this question for weeks. She had her answer ready, the practical one, the sensible one about options narrowing and land being wide, and a woman needing somewhere to put her capabilities to use. Instead, what she said was, "Because when I read your letter underneath all the requirements, I could see that you were grieving, and I thought that might mean you were capable of more than your letter said." The rain fell between them and the hills. After a moment, Jeremiah said, "My mother would have liked you." It was, coming from him, an extraordinary statement. She knew enough about him by now to understand that Margaret Donnelly had been the center of his world, and that her loss had been the thing that had collapsed the center of it, and that he did not invoke her lightly. "Tell me about her," Ella said. And he did. He talked about his mother the way water comes out of dry ground after a long rain, haltingly at first and then with increasing ease, and Ella listened without interrupting, which was something she did only when the thing being said deserved the full space of listening. He talked about how his mother had come from Ireland as a young woman with $30 and a determination that he had never seen matched, how she had built this house out of nothing alongside his father, who had died when Jeremiah was 19. How she had kept the ranch going through drought and cattle fever, and the years after the war when everything in Texas was uncertain and dangerous. How she had been fierce and sharp-tongued and absolutely without meekness, and how the ranch had survived because of it. Ella kept her face still, but she felt the word land in her chest like a stone in still water, absolutely without meekness. "She sounds remarkable," Ella said. "She was," he said. "She would have told me that letter I sent to the agency was the stupidest thing I'd ever done." There was a pause. Ella looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the rain with something in his expression that was lighter than what usually lived there. "For what it's worth," she said, "I agree with her." The sound he made was almost a laugh. Almost. It was the closest she'd heard him come to one, and it sent something warm spiraling up her spine that she did not examine closely. The confrontation with Bill Hayes happened on the 12th of November, 1878, on a clear, cold morning when the air tasted of the approaching winter. Jeremiah drove the wagon to Hayes's supply yard with Ella beside him on the seat, and she had the ledger on her lap with every discrepancy marked in red ink in her neat, precise hand. Hayes came out of his warehouse with his usual expression of professional cordiality, which held through greetings and handshaking, and lasted approximately until the moment Ella opened the ledger and began reading numbers. His face went through several transformations. First disbelief, then the kind of smile men produce when they are managing a situation they consider trivial, then something harder when the numbers continued and the case became irrefutable. "Those are clerical errors," he said, "pricing notes taken down wrong." "By whom?" Ella asked. "The errors are in your invoices, Mr. Hayes, not in the ranch records." "There's been a misunderstanding. There has been a pattern," Ella said, turning a page. "Consistent over 2 years, always in the same direction. I don't believe misunderstandings are that organized." Hayes looked at Jeremiah. The look was intended to go over Ella's head, a man-to-man communication suggesting that the woman's intervention was the real problem here, and that the two men could arrive at a reasonable understanding without her involvement. Jeremiah looked back at Hayes with an expression that made the suggestion fall dead on the cold November ground. "You'll return the overcharge," Jeremiah said. "Miss Carter will give you the figure. We'll settle it in cash or in future deliveries, your choice. If you'd prefer I take this to the county sheriff, that's another option." Hayes was red in the face. He looked at Ella with something in his eyes that was not goodwill. "You want to be careful," he said, directing it at Ella, "about sticking your nose into business that was running fine before you arrived." "It was running fine for you," Ella said evenly. "Less fine for the Donnelly ranch." The settlement was made in cash, after some negotiation that involved Hayes significantly reducing his initial counteroffer of nothing and eventually arriving at a number that Ella found acceptable. She let Jeremiah do the final negotiating, because she had learned enough about men in these situations to know when stepping back served better than stepping forward. But she stayed present, and she kept the ledger open in her hands, and she did not pretend not to understand the numbers. On the way back, the wagon rocking over the limestone road in the cold morning light, Jeremiah said nothing for a while. She watched the hills and was content with the silence. "You were right to take that on," he said eventually. "I know," she said, which was not the modest response he might have expected and which was true. He glanced at her with something in those green eyes that she was finding harder and harder to categorize. "Most women I've known," he said carefully, "would have let that go, would have thought it wasn't their business." "Most women I've known," she replied, "were taught to let things go until the things got so large they couldn't be lifted at all." She paused. I find it more efficient to address problems while they're still small enough to carry." He was quiet for a moment. "Ella," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it, and she felt the intimacy of it move through her like a current. "Yes, I'm glad you came," he said. "Even if you're nothing like what I asked for." She looked at the road ahead and let herself smile, just briefly and privately, in the way she had learned to smile in her father's house, small and turned inward where it was safe. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, "because I have no intention of becoming what you asked for." He made that almost laugh sound again. This time it went a little further. She decided she wanted very much to hear it go all the way. December was cold in the hill country, cold in the way that surprised people who assumed Texas was all heat, with frost on the limestone in the mornings, and an ice skin on the water troughs that Hector broke with a boot heel before the cattle came to drink. Ella had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and something had shifted so gradually and so thoroughly that she found it difficult to identify the moment it had changed, only to note that it had. She and Jeremiah ate together every evening now, and the silences between them had the quality of shared space rather than separate distance. He had taken to telling her things about the ranch, not just facts but stories, the year the creek flooded and they lost 40 head, the time a mountain lion worked the southern pasture for 3 weeks before Hector tracked it off the property, the hard winter of 1873 when the ground was frozen and they burned fence posts to keep the pipes from going solid. And she told him things about Philadelphia, small things and then larger things, not the things she had not yet told him, but the shape of herself before she arrived in his kitchen with his letter in her fist. The night he asked her about her father, she told him most of the truth. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them and the December wind outside, and she had been going over the winter supply calculations, and he had looked up from the bridle he was repairing and asked with the directness that was characteristically his, "You said your father is a merchant. What kind?" "Import and export," she said. "Primarily dry goods and some hardware. He has accounts in New York and 2 in Baltimore." "Successful," she chose her words. "He was. He brought a partner in 4 years ago who I believe has been diverting funds." She kept her eyes on the paper. "I tried to document it. Partner became aware of what I was doing and suggested I would be wise to leave." The silence was very complete. She looked up. Jeremiah had set down the bridle and was looking at her with full attention. "He threatened you," he said. "It was not a question." "In the way that careful men threaten," she said. "Nothing explicit. Implications. Suggestions about reputation and instability and what it would mean for a woman in my position to make accusations against a well-regarded man." "And your father?" "My father loves me," she said, and the truth of that was complicated and she let him hear the complication in it. "He also trusts Marsh. He has trusted him for 4 years and the business appears to be doing well by every measure he can see. I could not convince him. The evidence you gathered is in my trunk," she said, "and in a letter with a friend in Philadelphia to be forwarded to a lawyer if anything happens to me." Jeremiah was very still. "You came here with that hanging over you," he said slowly. "I came here because it was the best option available," she said. "And because I thought distance from Philadelphia would reduce the urgency from Marsh's perspective. If I'm not making noise, he has no reason to act. But you have the evidence." "I do." He turned that over in silence. She watched him think and found she liked the way he thought, thorough and serious, and without the performative decisiveness some men used to disguise the fact that they weren't thinking at all. "We should write to a lawyer," he said. "Someone in San Antonio. File copies of what you have. Make sure it's not just in one place." "I'd thought the same thing," she said. I didn't know if she stopped. "If I'd want to be involved," he said. "If it would be fair to involve you," she said honestly. "It's my trouble, not yours." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the lamplight his face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the guardedness set aside for a moment, and what was underneath it was something that made her breath catch very quietly. "Ella," he said, "you've been in this house 2 months and you've sorted out my accounts, confronted my fraudulent supplier, organized 10 years of papers in my study, and fed me better than I've eaten since 1876. He paused. Your trouble is my trouble. That's what this is supposed to be. She looked at the flame in the lamp. Her throat felt tight in a way she did not entirely know what to do with. That's a very practical way of expressing it, she managed. I'm a practical man, he said. Most of the time. She looked at him then, and he was looking at her with something in his expression that was no longer particularly practical at all, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the December wind moved through the cedar trees with a sound like breathing. They did not speak about what had almost been said that night. But it lived between them from that point forward, patient and persistent as the limestone under the Texas soil. January of 1879 brought the kind of cold that reminded everyone in the hill country that the land was not tame. 2 of the younger cattle took sick with something that Hector identified as pneumonia, and there were 3 days of driving sleet that kept everyone close to the house and the barn, and Ella found herself learning more about cattle medicine than she had anticipated and developing strong opinions about the application of poultices to bovine respiratory complaints. It was during these 3 days, confined and cold and working alongside Jeremiah in the barn through the hours when the sleet came down hardest, that the thing between them stopped being an almost thing and became something recognizable. They were in the barn past midnight on the second night, taking turns sitting with the sickest of the 2 cattle, when Jeremiah fell asleep sitting against the stall wall with his coat pulled up and his hat over his face. Ella, who was not sleeping, sat across from him in the lamplight and looked at him for a long time without the usual social regulation that required her to pretend she wasn't looking. He was, she acknowledged, a very good-looking man. That was not the thing that moved her. The thing that moved her was the way his face looked in sleep, unguarded in the way it sometimes was in waking moments, but more completely, the hardness that the land put into working men temporarily released, and what was underneath it was something that was much younger than the person he carried in daylight. She thought about his mother and the handkerchief in the study, and the child's drawing of a horse that she had set with such care in the untouched pile. She thought about the letter he had written to the agency 9 months ago, a list of practical requirements from a man who was drowning in grief and had no idea that what he was actually asking for was someone to help him surface. She thought about Gerald Marsh in Philadelphia, who had looked at her and seen only an obstacle to be managed, and she thought about the way Jeremiah had said, "Your trouble is my trouble," without any calculation in his voice, with the simplicity of a man who meant what he said. The cattle stirred. The lamp burned low. Ella got up to trim the wick, and when she turned around, Jeremiah was awake and watching her. "How long have I been asleep?" he asked. "About an hour," she said. "You should have woken me." "You needed the rest." He studied her. In the low lamplight in the barn in the January cold, there was nowhere for either of them to be except exactly where they were. "Ella," he said. "Yes." "I owe you an apology," he said. "For the letter, for what I asked for." It was he stopped, and she could see him searching for words which he normally found easily. It was a coward's way of asking for help. She sat back down across from him. "Tell me what you actually wanted," she said. "Not what you wrote, what you actually wanted." He was quiet for a long moment. "Someone who would stay," he said finally. "Someone who would look at this land and this life and not want to be somewhere else." "Someone," he stopped again. "Someone like your mother," she said gently. He looked at her sharply. "Someone who could make this a home again," he said. "Not manage it, not endure it. Someone who could look at it and see what I see when I look at it." "And what do you see?" she asked. "Everything," he said simply. 1,400 acres of everything. She looked at the barn wall, at the yellow lamplight on the timber, at the sound of the sleet on the roof and the warm animal smell of the cattle, and the way the darkness outside the barn door was absolute and intimate. "I see that too," she said. "I've been seeing it since I arrived." He looked at her for a very long time. Then he reached across the straw-covered floor and took her hand, very carefully, as if he was not sure he had the right to do it and was doing it anyway. She let him. They sat like that in the January barn with the sleet coming down and the lamp burning low, and it was not romantic in any of the ways the novels she had read described romance. It was better than that. It was real. The cattle recovered. The sleet stopped. The sun came back cold and brilliant over the limestone hills, and January moved into February with the particular tenderness of a season that knows it is about to yield to something warmer. There had been no formal declaration. No elaborate moment. There had been a series of moments, accumulating like snowfall until the landscape was entirely changed. The way he handed her a cup of coffee in the morning and their fingers touched on the handle, the evenings on the porch when they sat close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, the morning she had found him reading one of her Philadelphia books without asking permission, and she had said nothing at all, just taken the chair across from him and picked up her mending, and they had sat in the same warm room in the same warm silence for 2 hours. Tom noticed. Tom was 23 and observant in the way young people are when they are lonely, which is to say mercilessly. "You two going to get married?" he asked Ella one morning in February with the cheerful directness of someone who had no particular social filter. "That," Ella said, "is between Mr. Donnelly and myself. Because Hector says it's about time," Tom continued undeterred, "and I agree with Hector, and also it would be real nice to have a proper Christmas next year because this year was—" "Tom," Ella said, "Ma'am, go mend the fence." He went, grinning, and Ella looked at her hands and smiled at them very quietly. The proposal, when it came, was characteristic of the man who made it. It was a Tuesday in late February, cold and clear, and Ella had spent the morning writing a letter to a lawyer in San Antonio named Whitmore, who had been recommended to them by the county judge at Jeremiah's request. She had enclosed copies of the most critical documents from her trunk, the ones that demonstrated Marsh's pattern most clearly. Whitmore had responded with interest and had asked for more information, and the wheels of something formal and legal were beginning to turn, which meant that Gerald Marsh in Philadelphia was no longer only her problem and her secret. She was sealing the envelope at the kitchen table when Jeremiah came in at midday, earlier than usual, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen in his coat and hat and looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been unusually quiet for 4 days." He came fully into the kitchen and sat down across from her, and he folded his hands on the table in the way he did when he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because the house needs managing, not because the accounts need keeping. I can hire people for those things." He paused. "I want to marry you because I have not looked forward to supper in 2.5 years, and since you've been here I have looked forward to it every day. Because you argue with me when I'm wrong and you don't argue with me when I'm right, which tells me your judgment is good. Because when I found out what you were carrying from Philadelphia, my first thought was not that you'd brought trouble here, but that you'd been carrying it alone for too long, and I was angry on your behalf." He looked at his hands and then at her. "And because I think about you considerably more than is practical, which is new for me, and I've decided I'd rather do something about it than not." Ella looked at him across the table. The envelope was in her hands. The February light came through the window and lay across the oak table and across his face. "That is the most practical declaration of love I have ever heard," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." "Jeremiah," she said, and his name in her voice was its own kind of declaration. "Yes, yes," she said, "I will marry you." He looked at her, and the guardedness came down completely, every wall, and what was underneath it was something so undefended and certain that she felt it land in the very center of herself like something arriving home. He reached across the table again, as he had in the barn in January, and this time he took both her hands, and this time he was not tentative about it. "I wrote a terrible letter," he said. "You wrote a grief-stricken letter," she said. "And it was the worst letter I've ever read, and it led me directly here, and I am grateful for every word of it." He brought her hands up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, very briefly, with a gentleness that she had always known was in him under the practical exterior. and she let herself feel the full warmth of it without managing it or containing it or turning it into something smaller than it was. They were married at the end of March 1879, in the parlor of the Donnelly Ranch by the circuit preacher, who came through Cibolo Creek twice a year, with Hector and Tom as witnesses and Mrs. Greer from the neighboring spread who had appointed herself interested in the proceedings and had arrived with a pie. The parlor had been cleaned and properly furnished by this point, the dust gone, the curtains replaced. A photograph of Margaret Donnelly hung on the wall in a frame Ella had found in the study and cleaned up and placed there with Jeremiah's knowledge and his expression of quiet gratitude. Ella wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool, and she put her hair up properly for the occasion, and when she came down the stairs and Jeremiah turned to look at her from the parlor doorway, he went very still in the way he went still when something mattered to him deeply and he did not know what to do with it. "You look," he started. "Don't struggle," she said, coming down the last steps. "I can see it's difficult for you." "Beautiful," he said, without struggling at all, and said it with such directness and simplicity that it bypassed every sophisticated defense she had ever constructed and went straight to the center of her. The preacher arrived and said the words, and they said their own words back. And when it was done, Hector shook Jeremiah's hand for a very long time with the solemn expression of a man witnessing something that has been needed for years. And Tom ate most of Mrs. Greer's pie without apology, and the March sun came through the parlor windows and lay over everything like a benediction. That night, after the visitors had gone home and Tom and Hector had made themselves scarce with the discreet efficiency of men who understood the situation, Ella and Jeremiah sat on the porch in the cold, clear evening, and she was wearing his coat over her good dress because it was still March and March did not negotiate. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I am," she said, genuinely and without qualification. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and there was nothing complicated in it, nothing held back. "More than I knew how to expect." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they looked at the dark hill country and the extraordinary stars overhead, and she thought about how very far this was from Philadelphia and how completely right it was, and the small stone that had lived in her chest since she arrived began, very quietly, to dissolve. Spring came to the hill country with wildflowers that Ella was entirely unprepared for. Bluebonnets up the roadsides and across the pastures in great purple-blue sweeps, Indian paintbrush bright as fire, the pale evening primrose opening in the evenings along the creek. She had been told the hills were beautiful in spring, and she had not fully understood what that meant until she was standing in the middle of the south pasture with the cattle grazing around her and the flowers going to the horizon in every direction. Jeremiah found her there and stood beside her in comfortable silence. "Every year," he said. "And you never tired of it," she said. "Never once." She slipped her hand into his and he held it, and that was enough. The matter of Gerald Marsh reached its resolution in April, in a manner that was both satisfying and somewhat anticlimactic. Whitmore, the San Antonio lawyer, had taken the case seriously and with quiet efficiency, corresponding with a colleague in Philadelphia who had connections to the district court there. The documents Ella had brought, and those she had had forwarded by Clara, had been sufficient to open a formal inquiry into Marsh's conduct. Marsh had apparently, upon learning of the inquiry, made the tactical error of attempting to purchase silence in ways that were themselves criminal, which had accelerated the timeline considerably. A letter arrived from Whitmore at the end of April. Marsh had been removed from the business partnership, was facing charges of fraud, and the business had been placed temporarily under independent management. Her father, Whitmore wrote with some delicacy, had been required to acknowledge certain irregularities in the accounts that had previously been attributed to error. There was no legal action against Ella's father, but there was a considerable reckoning of a personal kind suggested between the lines. Ella read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. Jeremiah was watching her. He had learned to read her silences, which one they were, whether she was thinking or feeling or managing something or deciding something. "It's over," she said. "Good?" he asked. She thought about her father and the complicated love that had always existed between them, the love that was real and the failures that were also real, and the fact that Gerald Marsh had been standing between her father and the truth for 4 years and her father had chosen not to look. "Good," she said. "And complicated. I need to write to my father." "Do that," he said. "And when you're ready, we'll invite him here if you want." She looked up at him. "You'd have him here. After, he's your father," Jeremiah said simply. "Whatever else he is, he's that, and this is your home." She stood up from the table and crossed to where he was standing and kissed him, not for the first time, but with a particular intention, a particular fullness. He returned it with that directness he brought to everything that mattered, one hand at the side of her face, warm and certain. "You are nothing like what I asked for," he said against her mouth. "I know," she said. "I am so profoundly grateful." She laughed, genuinely and fully, a laugh she had been finding more easily since March, and he smiled against her hair, the smile that had been coming out more often, the complete one. And the kitchen was warm and the spring air came through the open window with wild flowers in it. And they were, undeniably, entirely, happily where they were supposed to be. The summer of 1879 was busy in the way that all summers on a working ranch are busy. But it was busy in a new way, a way that had the quality of partnership rather than solitude. Ella took over the account keeping entirely, with Jeremiah's full endorsement, and the ranch finances in her hands began to look like something organized and purposeful, rather than the accumulated evidence of a man too occupied to sit down. She identified 2 additional supplier relationships that were below the quality they should have been for the price being paid, and renegotiated them without drama. She established a working relationship with the bank manager in San Antonio, a serious man named Alderson, who had initially been visibly skeptical of conducting business with a woman, and had within 3 meetings revised his opinion entirely, a revision he communicated to Jeremiah by saying, "Your wife is the most precise business person I have encountered this side of the Alamo, sir, and I mean that in every positive sense." Jeremiah had told her this with such proud satisfaction that she had been more moved by it than she expected, not because she needed the banker's validation, but because of what it looked like on Jeremiah's face when he reported it. She also kept the house, which she had long since transformed from the state in which she found it into something that was genuinely and warmly inhabited. The kitchen was organized and functional. The parlor was comfortable. The study was orderly. She had hung things on the walls that she had found in the house, including 2 of Margaret Donnelly's paintings, small landscapes of the hill country in oil that she had apparently done in her younger years, and that were, to Ella's considerable surprise, genuinely skilled. Jeremiah had not been able to look at them for 2 years after his mother's death. He could look at them now. "She would have approved of how you've handled all of this," he said one evening in the summer, the 2 of them sitting on the porch in the long light of a July evening. "The house or the accounts?" "Both," he said. "And herself. She would have approved of you." Ella looked out at the hills in the gold light and felt the full warmth of that, allowed herself to receive it completely. "I would have approved of her," she said. Tom found a girl in Cibolo Creek that summer, a young woman named Maria who helped at the dry goods store, and fell into a state of moony distraction that Hector found hilarious and Jeremiah found slightly threatening to the fence maintenance schedule. Ella found it charming and told Tom so, which caused him to look at her with the dazzled gratitude of a young man who has been understood. Hector, who had been with the ranch for 12 years and was in his mid-40s and had, as far as anyone could tell, no interest in any kind of romantic entanglement, looked at Ella with the quiet approval that was the most he gave anyone and was, on his scale, essentially an extravagant compliment. "The ranch is better," he said one day, out of nowhere, handing her a bucket of apples from the small orchard behind the house. "Since you came." "Thank you, Hector," she said. "Donnelly needed it," he continued, setting down the bucket with the efficiency he brought to everything. "He was going dry out here, like the creek in August, still there but not running." She thought about that, about a man going dry inside a successful enterprise, keeping everything externally functional while something essential stopped flowing. "He's running now," she said. Hector nodded once with the finality of a verdict delivered. "He is," he said, and went back to work. In the fall of 1879, Ella discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for about a week before she was certain, and she sat with the certainty for an entire day before she told Jeremiah, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted the knowledge to herself for a little while, warm and private and wholly hers, before it became the shared thing it would become. She told him in the evening on the porch, with the October stars coming out overhead and the cedar smell on the air. He was so still when she told him that she could not read him for a moment, and then she saw his face in the starlight, and what was on it was something she had not seen before, something entirely without composure, something that was not manageable or contained, but was raw and enormous and absolutely without qualification. He took her face in both hands and held it with such care that she felt tears prick the back of her eyes, which was not a thing that happened to her often. "Ella," he said, and her name in his voice was everything. "Yes," she said, covering his hands with hers. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that in the October night with the stars overhead and the sound of the creek below and the hills all around them. And she understood that she had not come to Texas to find safety or practicality or somewhere to put her capabilities to use. She had come here because this man existed, and this land existed, and this life was possible, and everything that had seemed like a narrowing of options from a gray Philadelphia office had been a corridor leading here. Her father wrote in November. He had been told, through Whitmore, something of the events and her role in them. The letter was long and complicated, and contained an apology that was not quite adequate but was his best attempt, and it contained also a love that she had always known was there under his failures, and that she had always found both too insufficient and too real to discard entirely. She wrote back. She told him about the ranch and the hill country and the October wildflowers she was looking forward to seeing in the spring. She told him about Jeremiah, not all of it, because some of it was not for letters. She told him about the baby. She did not invite him yet. But she left the door open in the way doors should be left, with intention and without false certainty about what would come through them. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and busy and domestic in the richest sense of the word, the sense that made domestic something chosen and inhabited rather than assigned and endured. Ella grew with the baby through November and December and January, and Jeremiah was attentive in ways that were practical and sincere and occasionally clumsy, bringing her extra blankets and checking on her at odd intervals, and once, memorably, consulting Hector about what to do about her back pain, an exchange that Hector recounted to Ella with the deadpan precision of someone who found this more entertaining than he let on. She was not, in her own words, a delicate condition. She was a pregnant woman on a working ranch, and she continued to work, adapting as necessary, making Jeremiah understand that worrying about her was welcome and restricting her was not, a distinction he grasped with better grace than she had anticipated. "I know," he said, when she made this point with some emphasis one February morning. "I'm not trying to put you in a box. I'm just—" He stopped. "Worried," she supplied. "Terrified," he said, with a candor that was characteristic of him at his most honest, and that she found more affecting than any amount of smooth reassurance. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which was increasingly a geometric challenge, and he held her with that careful absolute certainty she had come to know as his specific language of love. "Everything will be fine," she said. "I am not a fragile woman." "I know," he said into her hair. "That is not why I'm terrified. I'm terrified because I would very much like to not lose you." She pulled back and looked at him. The light in his green eyes was very direct and very vulnerable. "You are not going to lose me," she said. "Promise." "I promise," she said, which was the kind of promise you could not guarantee but which some promises needed to be made anyway, and which she made with every intention of keeping. The baby came in March of 1880, a year after their wedding almost to the week, as if he had a sense of occasion. He arrived in the small hours of a Thursday morning, with the spring wind coming through the cracked window and the bluebonnets already beginning in the south pasture, accompanied by a midwife from Cibolo Creek named Mrs. Flores, who was compact and efficient, and who managed Jeremiah's pacing in the hall with a firm hand. He was, in Mrs. Flores's professional assessment, a fine, healthy boy, which was information Jeremiah received through the closed bedroom door, and which Ella heard him receive with a sound that was entirely new, a sound she had never heard from him, which was essentially a grown man briefly becoming something much less armored. She held her son in the March night and looked at him in the lamplight, his dark hair and his hands the size of walnuts and his face arranged in the severe and slightly outraged expression of the newly arrived, and she loved him with the force of something geological. Jeremiah came in when Mrs. Flores permitted it, which was after a certain amount of cleaning up and a period of recovery that she enforced with professional authority. He came to the side of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Ella, and his face was doing that thing again, the thing it did when he was feeling something so large that his usual composure simply could not contain it. He sat on the edge of the bed and she shifted the baby toward him, and he took his son with the careful hands of a man who understood how to hold something that required protection, and he looked down at the small face with an expression that was the opposite of the man who had written 8 requirements and not one of them about companionship. "What shall we call him?" Ella asked. He was quiet for a moment. "James," he said. "For my father." He paused. "Is that James?" she said. "Yes." "James Margaret," he said and looked at her. She felt the middle name land, her throat tightening. "James Margaret Donnelly," she said. "That is a very fine name." He smiled then, the complete smile. And in the lamplight of the bedroom on the Donnelly ranch in March of 1880, with the spring coming through the window and the bluebonnets in the fields and the creek running after the winter rains, it was so full and so certain, and so entirely without reservation, that she felt it warm her from her chest outward like sunlight moving through a room. James Margaret Donnelly was loud and demanding, and had his father's green eyes, and his mother's disposition toward not accommodating anyone unnecessarily, which caused Hector to observe, without any particular emotion, that the baby was exactly what he had expected. Tom married Maria in June, a small ceremony in town that the entire Donnelly household attended with the enthusiasm of people who had been collectively invested in the outcome since approximately August. Ella stood with Maria's mother during the ceremony and watched Tom's face during his vows, and thought about her own face during hers, and felt a continuity that was both specific and enormous, this particular strand of human reaching toward human in a vast, indifferent landscape. Maria was, as it turned out, a welcome addition to the extended household that the ranch had become, smart and warm and practical in ways that complemented Tom's particular blend of optimism and general spatial unawareness. Ella liked her immediately with the unreserved appreciation she gave to women who did not hide their intelligence. The summer of 1880 was prosperous. The cattle prices were good, the accounts were healthy, and the ranch had something it had lacked for years, which was the quality of being genuinely alive. Ella had begun a kitchen garden in the spring, which had expanded by midsummer into something considerably more ambitious than a kitchen garden, and which Jeremiah had looked at with bemused admiration and begun to help with in the evenings, the two of them in the garden in the long summer light, with James in a basket nearby being watched over by whichever of the hands was not otherwise occupied. Her father came to visit in September. He arrived on the stage in Cibolo Creek, older than she remembered and somehow smaller, which was a thing that happened with parents and distance and time, The way people in memory are the size they were when they held authority and in person have been scaled by the plain facts of aging. He climbed down from the stage in his city coat and looked at the limestone hills and the cedar breaks and the wide sky of South Texas with an expression of genuine bewilderment. Ella met him at the stage stand. He looked at her for a long moment. She had changed, she knew. Not in the ways that could be catalogued, not taller or differently dressed, but in some fundamental quality of occupancy in herself, the way a person looks when they are living in their own life rather than being moved through one. "Ella," he said. "Papa," she said, and put her arms around him. He held her with the slightly stiff emotion of a man who was not entirely comfortable with feeling things in public, and she felt the old complicated love for him, the love that had survived his failures and his silences and his preference for the smooth surface of things over the difficult truth underneath. "You look well," he said, stepping back. "I am well," she said. "Very well. Come and meet my husband." The meeting between Jeremiah and her father was one of the more precise social negotiations she had observed in her life. Two men who were both quiet and direct and had strong opinions and were each separately important to her, circling one another with the careful courtesy of people who understood the stakes and had decided to take the long view. By the second day, they were talking about cattle prices. By the third, Jeremiah was showing him the South pasture. By the time her father left at the end of the week, they had arrived at something that was not friendship yet, but was the solid foundation on which friendship could be built. And her father had held James for nearly an hour on the last morning, looking at his grandson with an expression that stripped away every layer of the man who had chosen smoothness over his daughter's courage and left something underneath that was much simpler and much truer. "I should have believed you," he said to her when the stage was an hour away and they were saying goodbye. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He winced. "I know that it wasn't enough," he said. "My believing you later after it was proven." "I know that. It isn't nothing," she said. "It's just not the same as believing me in the first place." She looked at him. "But we can work with it if you want to." He looked at her with something in his face that she had not often seen, something humble. "I do," he said. "Then come back in the spring," she said. "When the bluebonnets are out, I want you to see them." He promised he would, and she believed him, because whatever her father's failures, he had not been a man who made promises he did not keep. The stage took him east and she stood on the road and watched it go, James on her hip pulling at her hair with determined small hands, and Jeremiah came and stood beside her and said nothing, because he understood when saying nothing was the right choice. After a moment she turned from the road and they walked back toward the ranch, the two of them and James, in the September afternoon that smelled of cedar and approaching autumn. "Thank you for having him here," she said. "He's your father," Jeremiah said. "And he loves you, even if he doesn't always know how to show it without making a complete mess of it." "That is a remarkably generous assessment," she said. "I've made my own messes," he said simply. "I wrote a letter asking for a Meek woman and sent it to a matrimonial agency." She looked at him sideways with her eyebrow raised. "And how did that work out for you?" she asked. He took James from her arms without being asked, settling his son against his chest with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for 6 months, and he looked at her with those green eyes in the late afternoon light of South Texas in September of 1880. "Better than I deserved," he said, "and exactly as I hoped." She walked beside him on the limestone road with the hills around them and the sky overhead and the ranch ahead, and she thought about all the distances she had traveled, the distance from her father's house on Chestnut Street to this road in Bexar County, and the distance between who she had been required to be and who she actually was, and the distance between what Jeremiah had asked for and what he had been given, and how all those distances had turned out to be, not obstacles, but the exact path that had led here. She was not meek. She had never been meek. She had come into Jeremiah Donnelly's kitchen with dust on her dress and his letter in her fist and fire in her chest, and she had not become something smaller or quieter or more accommodating since. And the ranch was better for it, and the accounts were better for it, and the man walking beside her was better for it, and she was better for it. And the world was better for having in it people who refused to be less than themselves, for the convenience of those who found fullness uncomfortable. She would raise her son in this knowledge. She would raise him in a house where his father held his mother's hand without being asked, and where his mother's voice was heard without being managed down to nothing, and where the landscape was wide, and the work was real, and the love between the people in it was honest enough to include argument and grief and difficulty without being diminished by any of it. The following spring, as her father had promised, he came back. He arrived in March when the bluebonnets were at their full purple tide, and Ella walked him out to the south pasture where the flowers went to the horizon, and he stood in the middle of it looking like a man who had just understood something he had been missing for a long time. "I see why you stayed," he said. "I see why I came," she corrected, gently but precisely. He looked at her and recognized the distinction and nodded. The spring visit was longer than the fall one and warmer. Her father helped Hector with some work on the wagon, which Hector permitted with the air of a man doing a considerable favor that he was too dignified to acknowledge as such. Her father played with James in the yard in the evenings, the small boy who had his grandfather's dark hair and his grandmother Margaret's stubbornness and his mother's eyes, and her father looked, for the first time in many years, like someone who was not carrying everything he was carrying alone. He and Jeremiah found over the course of 2 weeks that they had more in common than their surface differences suggested. Both were men who had lost people they loved and carried the loss quietly and without fanfare. Both believed in work as something with inherent dignity. Both were, underneath their respective versions of self-containment, more genuinely affectionate than they allowed themselves to appear in most situations. On the last evening before her father left, Ella found the two of them on the porch with whiskey, talking in the low, serious voices of men who had gotten past the preliminary stages of acquaintance. She stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment without announcing herself, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled there before. Not everything was fixed. Marsh was facing trial and her father's business was recovering but diminished. The distance between Philadelphia and Texas was still real. But the damage to the tissue of her family had been acknowledged, which was the first step toward healing it. She went inside and picked up James from his cradle and held him in the kitchen window, looking out at the hills in the last of the spring light. He grabbed her finger with both hands and regarded her with the deeply serious expression of a 1-year-old engaged in important research. "This is where we live," she told him. "All of this, everything in every direction." He considered this information and appeared to find it acceptable. Jeremiah came in from the porch and stood beside her, looking out at the same hills. "What are you telling him?" he asked. "About the land," she said. He put his arm around her, pulling her and James both gently toward him, and looked out at the hill country in the last of the April light, the limestone catching the last gold before dark. "He'll love it," Jeremiah said. "How could he not?" "He will," she agreed. "He has excellent taste." She felt Jeremiah's quiet laugh against her temple, the complete one that had come more and more easily this year, the one that was all the way real. "He has his mother's taste," he said, "which is exceptional in every regard." She turned to look at him with one eyebrow raised. "You are getting better at this," she observed. "I am trying," he said. "I have an excellent teacher." She shook her head and looked back at the hills and could not prevent the smile that spread across her face, wide and uncontained and entirely unpractical. The smile she had been learning to stop hiding since she came to this ranch and found a man who preferred her actual face to any version she might have arranged for public consumption. James made a sound of commentary. "He agrees," Ella said. "Wise boy," Jeremiah said. The stars came out over the Donnelly ranch one by one, the way they did, as if being placed with care, each one finding its position in the enormous dark, and the three of them stood in the kitchen window as the dark came up from the hills, and the ranch settled into the evening around them, and the cedar and the stone and the creek and the cattle were all there. The 1,400 acres of everything that Jeremiah had described, and that Ella had seen clearly from the first week, and that James would grow up knowing as the world. And it was good, and it was real, and it was entirely, permanently, irrevocably theirs. 3 years after Ella Carter had stood in Jeremiah Donnelly's kitchen with his letter crinkled in her fist and fire in her eyes, she sat on the porch of the same house in the late afternoon of an October day in 1881, watching James, now 18 months old, and deeply committed to the project of crossing the yard under his own power without falling, while Jeremiah leaned on the porch rail beside her and watched the same thing with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. James got up, considered the ground with severity, and continued. "He's stubborn," Jeremiah said. "He is," Ella agreed. "He gets that from you. He gets that from both of us," she said. "You are the most persistently determined man I have ever known. You were still fixing that section of south fence in the dark last Tuesday because you had decided it was going to be done on Tuesday." Jeremiah considered this. "That's different from stubborn." "It is not. It's committed." "Jeremiah." "Yes. It's stubborn," she said. "It is a wonderful quality and you should be proud of it, and our son has inherited it from both his parents, and the world should probably prepare itself accordingly." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the smile he was containing, the way she had learned to feel it before it arrived, the slight shift in his breathing and the quality of the silence around him. "We're going to need more room," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her sidelong. "There will be more Donnellys," he said, "unless I am significantly misreading the situation." Ella smiled at the hills in the October light. She had known for about 2 weeks. She had been keeping it, warm and private and wholly hers, for just a little while before it became the shared thing it would become. "You are not misreading the situation," she said. His arm came around her, and she settled into his side, and James made it across the yard and stopped at the fence post and turned and looked back at them with an expression of profound self-satisfaction. Ella clapped for him. Jeremiah clapped for him. The boy appeared to regard this as his due, which was precisely what she had hoped for. The hills of Bexar County, Texas, stretched out to the south and west in the long October light, and the cedar trees had that October darkness on them, and somewhere out in the south pasture the cattle were moving toward the water, and the sky was the particular blue that only existed in Texas in October, deep and clear and enormous, and the Donnelly Ranch was exactly what it had always had the potential to be, a home in the full sense, inhabited and tended and loved. Ella Carter Donnelly, who had never been meek and had never been accommodating, and had arrived in this kitchen with her eyes open and her chin up, and the full force of herself entirely undiminished, sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her and her son in the yard and another child beginning in the spring. And she was, with completeness that she would not have thought possible in a gray Philadelphia office, reading a dismal list of requirements, happy. Not happy in the managed, careful way she had once hoped for. Not happy in the practical, considered, reasonable way she had once believed was the most a woman with her particular combination of qualities could expect. Happy in the full way. The way that had room in it for difficulty and disagreement and grief, and the occasional profound argument about fence maintenance schedules, and for all of it to exist inside something larger that was solid and permanent and real. Happy in the way that a person is happy when they are living exactly the life that was meant for them, which is the rarest and most extraordinary kind of happy there is. Jeremiah turned and looked at her, the green eyes in the October light, the face she knew better now than she had ever known any face. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That you wrote the worst letter I have ever read," she said, "and that I am grateful for every word of it." He smiled. The full smile. The one that had taken months to arrive and now came easily, readily, naturally, the way all the best things come when they are finally given the space they needed. "So am I," he said. The October evening moved over the hill country, and the stars began, and the lamp in the kitchen window was lit, and the Donnelly Ranch, all 1,400 acres of it, settled into the night the way it settled into every night, anchored and certain with its people in it, going forward.